The first sound was not the shouting. It was the wood giving way. A sharp crack above their heads, followed by the scrape of boots across the hallway floorboards. The mother did not look up. She kept her eyes on the thin line of mortar between the cellar stones, as if the wall itself might answer her if she stared long enough. Her youngest son's breath warmed her wrist. She shifted his face gently into her coat so the sound would not carry. The cellar had always smelled of potatoes and coal. Now it smelled of damp earth and dust shaken loose from the ceiling. A small bulb hung from a wire near the steps, but she had not dared to turn it on. Darkness pressed against them from all sides. She knew the shape of the room by memory: the crate of jars near the far wall, the broken chair leg leaning by the furnace, the shallow recess where her husband once kept tools before he left for the front and stopped writing. Above, men moved with certainty. Drawers were opened and shut without care. A chair tipped over. Someone laughed briefly, a short sound in a language she did not know well enough to follow but understood enough to fear. For years, she had been told what these voices meant. British soldiers were described in leaflets and radio speeches as looters, as men who would burn what they could not carry, who would punish families for the uniforms of their sons. She had absorbed those images quietly while washing clothes, while standing in bread lines. They had not felt real then. They felt real now. Her daughter's fingers dug into her sleeve. The girl was 8, old enough to understand that silence was not a game. The boy, 5, trembled in small, constant movements. She counted his breaths. 1, 2, 3. If they could remain unnoticed for a few minutes more, perhaps the soldiers would search the main rooms and leave. The cellar door was narrow and swollen from moisture. It stuck when opened quickly. She had discovered that by accident the winter before. She held on to that small fact as if it were protection. Boots paused above the cellar steps. A heavier tread shifted weight directly over their heads. Dust drifted down in a fine stream. Her daughter's hand tightened again. The mother lowered her head until her lips were close to the girl's ear. "Still," she whispered, barely forming the word. The handle above them rattled once. Then again, more forcefully. The wood creaked. She felt the urge to call out that there was nothing below but food and coal, that she had children, that there was no threat here. But propaganda had offered no guidance on pleading. It had only described the consequences of weakness. She remained silent. A voice spoke sharply. Another answered. The handle was tested again, then released. Boots retreated across the kitchen. A cupboard door slammed. Something heavy was dragged across the floor. She did not allow herself relief. Soldiers who failed to open a door might return with tools. Time became uneven. Minutes stretched and collapsed without warning. She imagined what the rooms above now looked like. The table overturned, her husband's photograph knocked from the shelf, flowers scattered across the boards. The house had survived bombings in the distance. It might not survive this. When the cellar door finally opened, it did so slowly. Not splintered, not forced. The swollen wood gave way with a groan as someone applied steady pressure. A beam of light cut down the steps, blinding in its brightness. She raised one hand to shield the children's faces. A figure filled the doorway. A helmet, a rifle held low but ready. Behind him, another man remained at the top of the stairs. The first soldier descended one step, then another, cautious but not hurried. He stopped halfway down, letting his eyes adjust to the darkness. The mother felt her throat close. She pushed herself upright, drawing the children behind her legs. She expected shouting. She expected to be ordered against the wall. Instead, the soldier spoke in accented German. "How many?" he asked. Her mind stumbled over the simplicity of the question. 3, she managed. "My children." The soldier nodded once. He did not raise his weapon. He took the remaining steps and stood at a respectful distance, as though approaching livestock that might startle. He glanced around the cellar, at the jars, the coal bin, the narrow window near the ceiling that admitted a strip of gray light. "No soldiers here?" he asked. "No." He studied her face for a long moment, perhaps measuring truth, perhaps only exhaustion. Her coat was thin. The children's shoes were mismatched, one pair too small. The boy's nose ran unchecked. None of this required translation. The second soldier appeared at the top of the stairs. "Clear," he called down. The man in the cellar answered in his own language. The word was short. It did not carry anger. The mother braced herself for what would follow. Orders to leave. Confiscation of food. She had heard stories from neighbors who fled east before the front reached them, stories of carts taken and houses emptied. She tightened her grip on her daughter's hand. Instead, the soldier stepped back toward the stairs. Before ascending, he paused. He reached into a pouch at his belt and withdrew something small wrapped in paper. He hesitated as if reconsidering, then extended his arm and set the parcel on the top of a crate near the steps. "For the children," he said. The words were careful, chosen slowly. She did not move. She could not reconcile the gesture with the images she had carried for years. The soldier did not wait for thanks. He turned and climbed the stairs. The door remained open for a moment, light pouring down, then closed again with a dull thud. Silence returned, but it was different now. Less violent, more uncertain. She listened for renewed movement above. There was some, but it sounded methodical rather than destructive. Drawers opened and shut with less force. Footsteps crossed the hallway once more. After several minutes, the front door closed. She remained still long after the last sound faded. Only when her son began to whimper did she step forward and retrieve the paper-wrapped item. Her hands shook as she unfolded it. Inside was a small bar of chocolate, slightly melted at the edges. The children stared as if it were an object from another world. They had not tasted chocolate in months. She broke it carefully into 3 uneven pieces, giving the smallest to herself without thinking. The sweetness was sharp on her tongue, almost painful. It could be a trick, she thought. Some gesture meant to make them careless. Yet the soldiers had left without taking anything she could see. The jars remained. The coal bin was untouched. Even the photograph upstairs, when she finally climbed the steps to look, had been placed upright on the shelf. The rooms bore signs of search but not ruin. Chairs were moved back into place. Cupboards stood open but intact. A window had been opened briefly and then closed again. On the kitchen table lay a piece of paper with words she could not read and a mark indicating the house had been checked. She stood in the center of the room, unsure what she felt. Relief did not come cleanly. Instead there was a slow, uncomfortable loosening inside her chest, as though something tightly wound had been turned a fraction in the wrong direction. If the enemy behaved this way, what did that mean for everything she had been told? She did not question openly. There was no one to question. The children licked chocolate from their fingers and asked if the soldiers would return. The cellar had not been built for living. It had been built for jars of preserved cabbage and potatoes packed in sand, for coal stacked in uneven pyramids, for tools that smelled faintly of oil. Now it held 4 people who tried not to breathe too deeply. The air carried dampness from the earth behind the stone walls. It clung to their throats and settled in their lungs. The single candle had been extinguished an hour earlier to save oxygen and to avoid any sliver of light escaping through the warped door at the top of the stairs. Anna kept one hand on her youngest son's shoulder. The other pressed against the packed dirt floor to steady herself. Her fingers were cold despite the closeness of her children. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind since the first rumors reached their town, stories whispered in queues for bread, in the pauses between air raid sirens. British soldiers were advancing. They were said to be disciplined, but that word had carried no comfort. Discipline could mean efficient cruelty. It could mean order imposed without hesitation. Her daughter, Lise, 7 years old, leaned against her side. The girl had stopped asking questions. Earlier, she had wanted to know if the British would take their house. If they would burn it. If they would take her father, though he had already been gone for 2 years, captured somewhere in North Africa and now, according to the last Red Cross card, a prisoner in England. Anna had answered in the only way she knew, by telling her to be quiet. Above them the house creaked. It was an old sound, familiar, usually harmless. Tonight it felt deliberate. Each shift of wood carried intention. They heard cupboards opened. Footsteps crossed the kitchen floor. A chair scraped. The children stiffened with every movement, as if the house itself had begun to betray them. Anna had been taught what to expect. British troops were described as arrogant occupiers, trained to despise Germans. She had heard that they shot first and asked questions later, that they punished entire families for imagined resistance. The radio had spoken of brutal camps where German prisoners were left to starve. She had not known what to believe, but fear required no verification. It filled the gaps on its own. The cellar door was the only barrier between her children and the unknown above. She watched it as if she could stop it from opening by sheer focus. The wood was thin, the latch old. She knew how easily it could give way. Then the footsteps changed direction. They paused at the top of the cellar stairs. No one moved. The first step downward was slow. The boards creaked under the weight. The sound was not rushed. It was measured, as if whoever descended had no reason to hurry. That calmness unsettled her more than shouting would have. Another step. Then another. Boots on wood. Firm, controlled. Her son buried his face into her coat. She felt the dampness of his breath through the fabric. Her own heartbeat seemed too loud. She worried it would echo through the door. The latch lifted. The door opened halfway. Light from a handheld torch cut through the darkness in a narrow beam. It found the far wall first, then shifted, scanning the small room. The children squinted. Anna raised her hand to shield their faces. A man stood at the threshold. British uniform. Helmet. Rifle held low but ready. His face was younger than she expected, clean-shaven, pale under the dust of travel. He looked at them without speaking. Behind him, another soldier waited on the stairs. The first man said something in English. Anna understood only fragments from school lessons long ago. Civilians, come up safe. His accent was clipped, controlled. She did not move. The soldier hesitated. He lowered the rifle further, almost awkwardly, as if unsure where to put it. He switched to slower words. No harm, please. The children stared at him. Lisa's eyes were wide, fixed on the rifle. Anna rose carefully, her legs stiff from crouching. She kept her hands visible. She had heard that sudden movements could be fatal. Her voice came out hoarse. Kinder, she whispered, urging them to stand. They climbed the stairs one by one. The second soldier stepped aside to make space. Neither reached for the children. Neither touched them. The kitchen above looked disturbed but not destroyed. Drawers open, cupboards searched. A sack of flour had spilled onto the table, but it had not been trampled. A loaf of bread remained untouched. Anna noticed this immediately. She had expected the worst, that hungry troops would strip the house bare. More soldiers moved through the hallway, checking rooms. Their movements were systematic. One glanced at a framed photograph of her husband in uniform on the mantel. His expression did not change. He placed it back exactly where it had stood. Outside, engines idled. She could see the outline of military vehicles through the front window. Smoke drifted in the distance from a warehouse that had burned earlier in the day. The town felt suspended, as if waiting to see what occupation would mean in practice. The first soldier removed his helmet. He wiped his forehead with his sleeve. Up close, Anna saw fatigue in his eyes. Not anger. Not triumph. Just exhaustion. He gestured toward the table and mimed eating. Food, he asked. She hesitated. Was this a demand? A test? She nodded slowly and cut what remained of the bread into thin slices. Her hands trembled as she placed them on a plate. The soldier shook his head gently and pushed the plate back toward the children. For them, he said. The word was clear. Anna stared at him. It did not fit the images she had carried. She had prepared for shouting, for threats, for rough hands pulling her sons away. She had not prepared for refusal. One of the other soldiers entered, carrying a small tin. He spoke quietly to his companion, then crouched in front of the children. He opened the tin to reveal something pale and solid. He broke off a piece and offered it to Lise. Chocolate. The girl did not take it. She looked to her mother. Anna's mind moved through possibilities. Poison. Mockery. Some trick she did not yet understand. But the soldier waited patiently, arm extended, not forcing. After a long moment, she nodded. Lise reached out and accepted the piece. She held it in her palm as if it might disappear. Then she tasted it. The sweetness must have shocked her. Her expression shifted from suspicion to confusion. The soldiers watched without comment. In the doorway, another British soldier spoke to someone outside. A medic's bag was visible over his shoulder. Anna felt a new surge of fear. Were they expecting wounded? Were they searching for hidden fighters? The medic entered and looked at her youngest son, who had been coughing for weeks. He pointed to the boy's chest and raised his eyebrows in a silent question. Anna swallowed and nodded again. The cellar had long ago stopped feeling like a hiding place and begun to feel like a grave that simply had not yet been closed. The air was damp and sour with the smell of coal dust and unwashed clothes. A single candle, rationed in minutes rather than hours, burned low on an overturned crate. The children had been instructed not to cry, not to cough, not even to whisper unless spoken to. They had practiced stillness the way other children practiced sums or prayers. When the door above shifted, the sound carried down the narrow steps with a finality that made every muscle tighten at once. The hinges gave a small, unwilling groan. A blade of light fell across the packed earth floor and reached as far as the mother's shoes. She had not taken them off in days. She did not move. The children felt the change before they understood it. They pressed against her skirt, their fingers clutching the coarse fabric, faces turned into her side to avoid the brightness. The younger one trembled in small, rapid pulses. The older tried to steady him, copying the rigid composure he had seen in uniformed men passing through the village months before. Stillness was survival. They had been told that often enough. The mother had rehearsed this moment in her mind many times. If the door opened, there would be shouting. Orders barked in a language she had been taught to hate. Boots on the steps. A hand dragging them upward into daylight. She had imagined the children screaming despite their training. She had imagined herself begging despite her pride. In every version, it ended quickly. The figure at the doorway did not descend. It remained framed in the light, a shape without detail. For a second, there was only the quiet hum of afternoon beyond the cellar and the tight, dry sound of the mother swallowing. Then a voice spoke. It was not loud. It did not carry the sharp edges she had been prepared for. The words were English, unmistakably foreign, but the tone was controlled, almost measured. There was no laughter, no immediate demand. Just a statement, repeated once, as if to make it clearer. The mother did not answer. She did not trust herself to form the right sound. She understood enough of the language from school lessons long ago, before the war had hardened every classroom into a place of slogans. The voice said they were safe. It said there would be no harm. Her mind rejected the meaning before she could stop it. Safe was a word that had become dangerous. Promises had become traps. She had listened to speeches in the square that assured victory and protection. She had watched neighbors taken away for asking the wrong questions. She had believed once that uniforms guaranteed order. The war had taught her to be suspicious of any sentence that ended in reassurance. The voice spoke again, closer this time but still at the threshold. A single pair of boots descended one step, then stopped. The man did not rush. He did not point a weapon. He did not even step fully into the dark. The children dared to look. The light behind him obscured his face, but they could see the outline of a helmet, the cut of a coat not shaped like the ones they remembered from parades. It was wrong in small ways. The fabric hung differently. The posture was not rigid. He held himself as if he were entering a sickroom rather than storming a position. The mother forced herself to speak. Her voice came out rough and used. She asked what he wanted. She did not use polite forms. She did not offer explanations. She simply asked. There was a pause before he replied, as though he were choosing words with care. He said they had been found when neighbors reported movement. He said there would be food and a doctor if needed. He said they were not prisoners, not exactly, but they could not remain hidden. The area was being cleared. The language was imperfect on both sides. His German was slow and deliberate, marked by an accent that made the children exchange a brief, confused glance. It did not sound like the harsh caricatures they had heard imitated in propaganda films. It sounded like a man trying not to make a mistake. The mother searched his silhouette for signs of deception. She looked for impatience, for the tightening of shoulders that would signal violence. Instead she saw restraint. He kept one hand visible, open. The other rested near his belt but did not grip anything. When the younger child began to cry despite himself, the soldier did not shout for silence. He shifted his weight and waited. Waiting was what unsettled her most. Authority, as she had known it, did not wait. Cold crept up through the floor into her legs. They had been underground for days after rumors spread of arrests and reprisals. Food had run low. Water was rationed to sips. The older child's cough had grown worse in the damp. She had told herself that if they were discovered, it would at least end the uncertainty. Now uncertainty expanded instead of collapsing. Another voice called from above, asking something in English. The man at the doorway answered briefly. There was no urgency in the exchange. No coded signal. Just information passed between two people who seemed to assume they would be obeyed without raising their volume. The mother's thoughts moved quickly, then stalled. Everything she had been taught suggested that this was the moment to resist, to protect her children from humiliation or worse. But resistance required strength she no longer possessed. It also required certainty about the enemy. The figure in the doorway did not match the enemy she had imagined. He took another step down, slow enough to allow refusal. The light widened, revealing part of his face. He was younger than she expected. There was stubble along his jaw, a faint shadow under his eyes that suggested his own fatigue. He looked at the children first, not at her. His gaze held there, not with accusation, but with something like assessment. "You come," he said carefully in German. "Please." The words sounded awkward in his mouth. It did not fit the script she had rehearsed. The older child whispered that they should not believe him. He had heard stories of deception, of trickery used to draw people out. The mother felt the same warning rise inside her. Kindness could be a strategy. Softness could hide calculation. She had seen enough uniforms change hands to know that power shifted quickly. The sound in the cellar changed before anyone understood why. For hours it had been the same, distant concussions, the crack of rifle fire ricocheting between buildings, boots striking pavement in hurried bursts. The children had learned to measure danger by rhythm. Rapid footsteps meant men running. A single heavy tread meant someone searching. Silence meant waiting for the next shock. Now the silence held. The mother kept her hand pressed against the youngest boy's mouth, though he was no longer crying. The air in the cellar was sour with damp coal dust and the smell of unwashed bodies. A single candle had burned down to a stub. Its smoke curled against the low ceiling, staining it darker. They had not dared to open the door since dawn. When the latch above shifted, it did not crash inward as they expected. It moved cautiously, as though someone were testing whether it was locked. The mother felt her stomach tighten. For months she had trained herself to respond quickly, hide the ration cards, push the children behind the barrels, keep her eyes lowered. She had learned that hesitation invited suspicion. The door opened slowly. A rectangle of gray light cut across the floor. A figure stood at the threshold. The children saw only the outline, helmet, shoulders, a rifle angled downward. They did not recognize insignia. They knew only shapes associated with shouting and boots and hands that grabbed. The mother pulled the children closer. Her first thought was that these were Soviet soldiers. That was the terror repeated in every rumor. But the voice that followed did not bark in Russian. It spoke in a clipped, unfamiliar cadence. "Is anyone there?" The words were German, but heavily accented. The mother did not answer. She expected laughter, a command, the snap of a bolt drawn back. Instead there was a pause, then the rifle lowered fully. The man stepped down into the cellar, boots slow on the wooden steps. Another figure remained above, partially visible against the light. The children watched his face. He was younger than they had imagined an enemy to be. His cheeks were pale beneath stubble, eyes ringed with fatigue. Mud crusted the hem of his uniform trousers. He smelled of damp wool and smoke. He did not raise his weapon. He held it loosely, almost awkwardly, as if unsure where to put it in the confined space. The mother realized she was shaking. Not visibly, she had learned to keep that hidden, but inside, a tremor she could not suppress. For years she had heard that British soldiers were cold, mechanical men who despised Germans, who would humiliate them. She had pictured hard expressions and deliberate cruelty, punishment delivered with restraint but without mercy. The man's eyes moved across the cellar, taking in the barrels, the stacked potatoes, the children's thin coats. He seemed to hesitate over what to do next. "Frau," he said finally, pointing upward. "Come and see. It is safe." Safe was a word that no longer held meaning. The mother searched his face for mockery. There was none. Only exhaustion. She did not stand. He shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. From his pocket he withdrew something small and pale. He crouched, extending it toward the nearest child. A biscuit. It looked dry and foreign, square-edged. The boy stared. Hunger had been a constant companion for months, a hollow ache that sharpened thought and dulled emotion. But hunger also taught caution. Food offered by strangers could carry consequences. The soldier waited, arm extended. Not pushing it forward. Not demanding. The mother nodded once. The child stepped forward, trembling, and took it. The soldier did not smile. He simply nodded, as if acknowledging a completed exchange. Above them, another British voice called out. The man responded briefly in English. The tone was brisk but not urgent. The mother rose slowly, keeping herself between the soldier and her children. Her legs felt weak from hours of crouching. When she reached the steps, the second soldier moved aside to give her space. He did not touch her. Outside, the street looked smaller than she remembered. Windows were shattered. A cart lay overturned near the curb. Smoke drifted from somewhere beyond the next row of houses. The gunfire had moved farther away, reduced to distant pops. Several neighbors stood near their doorways under watch of 2 more British soldiers. No one was shouting. No one was being struck. The soldiers spoke quietly among themselves, occasionally gesturing toward buildings. The mother waited for orders that did not come. One of the British men approached carrying a metal canteen. He offered it to her. She hesitated again. Water could be contaminated, or perhaps accepting it signaled compliance. She could not measure the risk. The soldier held it steady. "Wasser," he said carefully. She took it. The water was cold and clean. She passed it to her eldest daughter, who drank too quickly and coughed. The mother felt something unfamiliar rising in her chest. Not gratitude, not yet. It was closer to confusion. She had prepared herself for degradation. She had rehearsed endurance. But there was nothing to endure in this moment. A stretcher team moved past at the end of the street. 2 British medics carried a wounded German soldier between them. His uniform was torn at the thigh, blood dark against the field-gray fabric. One medic pressed gauze firmly against the wound while speaking in calm, repetitive German phrases learned for this purpose. "Ruhig. Bleiben Sie ruhig." The mother stared. She had expected wounded Germans to be ignored, or worse. Instead, the medics worked methodically, as though uniform color were irrelevant to the task. The children watched the medics' hands. They saw only that the hands were steady and did not strike. A British officer approached the small group of civilians. He removed his helmet, revealing flattened hair damp with sweat. In halting German, he explained that they were to remain in their homes until further instruction. There would be food distribution later. Curfew at dusk. Anyone with weapons must surrender them. His voice was firm but not raised. The mother listened for threats behind the words. She heard none. The officer finished, replaced his helmet, and stepped back. For years she had believed that British discipline meant ruthless efficiency, that their restraint concealed contempt. Yet here the restraint appeared literal, men following procedure, not indulging emotion. She felt a flicker of shame at her own surprise. Had she truly believed that every foreign soldier desired her children's suffering? The propaganda had been relentless. Stories of atrocities, of cold-hearted islanders who bombed without pity and despised German families. She had absorbed those stories not because she trusted them fully, but because they simplified the world. Enemy. Ourselves. Fear made manageable through categories. Now the categories blurred. The youngest boy clutched the remaining half of his biscuit. He did not eat it immediately. He studied the soldier who had given it, watching for any sign of reversal. The soldier leaned against a wall, lighting a cigarette with shaking fingers. His gaze drifted down the street, alert but distant. The cellar had grown so familiar that the absence of noise above it felt unnatural. For months, sound had meant danger, boots on pavement, doors forced open, engines idling too long. Now the quiet pressed down with a different weight. The mother noticed it first in her hands. They would not stay still. Even after the steps had receded and the door upstairs had closed without being broken, her fingers continued to tremble against the damp wall. The children did not speak. They had learned not to. Silence had once been a game, then a discipline, and finally something closer to instinct. The younger boy kept his mouth slightly open, as if words might escape if he were not careful. His sister's eyes remained fixed on the narrow seam of light near the ceiling. It was daytime, though they could not see the sky. Time had been measured in breaths and in the careful distribution of bread. When the knock came again, softer this time, the mother's body reacted before her mind. Her arm extended across the children without thinking. She had been taught what British soldiers were supposed to be, ruthless in victory, eager to humiliate, determined to make examples of German families. The radio had said so often enough that it had taken root. Even after the broadcast stopped, the warnings remained. The door above opened with a scrape rather than a crash. There were voices, not shouted but steady. She could not make out the words, only the rhythm. Then the cellar door shifted. Dust fell from the frame. The children flinched but did not cry. A face appeared in the opening. Not the helmeted silhouette she had rehearsed in her nightmares, but a young man with tired eyes and a scarf pulled up against the cold. His uniform was unfamiliar in its details but unmistakable. He did not raise his weapon. He did not smile either. He simply looked down, taking in the space, the blankets, the pail in the corner. The mother stood slowly, aware of how thin she must appear. Her coat hung loosely at the shoulders. She kept her hands visible, palms open, the way she had once seen a captured pilot do in a newsreel. The young soldier spoke again, slower this time. She caught only fragments. All right. Safe. Come up. Safe was not a word she trusted. They climbed the stairs one at a time. The children's legs were stiff. The air in the kitchen felt sharp after the cellar's dampness. The windows were cracked but intact. Outside, the street was quiet in a way that did not match her memories of bombardment. A second soldier stood near the door, older, his face lined. He watched without expression as they emerged. No one shouted. No one searched the children. The older man nodded once and gestured toward a lorry parked at the corner. Other civilians were gathered there, women with bundles, an elderly man supported by a boy too young to be his grandson. No one spoke above a whisper. The mother searched their faces for signs of what had happened before she arrived. She saw only the same confusion reflected back. The ride was short. The children clutched her coat as the vehicle moved through streets she barely recognized. Buildings stood hollowed out, their facades intact but their interiors exposed. Laundry lines hung without laundry. At one intersection, a British medic knelt beside a German soldier whose uniform was dark with dried blood. The medic's movements were methodical. He cut away fabric, applied bandages, signaled to someone out of view. The wounded man did not resist. He looked upward, lips parted, as if trying to understand the hands that treated him. The mother felt something tighten in her chest that was not fear. She had expected indifference at best. The broadcasts had promised brutality, had warned that surrender meant degradation. Yet the scene passed without spectacle. The lorry did not slow. They were taken to a building that had once been a school. Desks had been pushed aside to make room for cots. The air smelled of disinfectant and wet wool. A British nurse moved between rows, checking temperatures, adjusting blankets. When she reached the children, she crouched to their level. Her German was limited, but her gestures were clear. She offered a cup of something warm. The younger boy hesitated, glancing at his mother. It was only tea. Thin, barely sweetened. He drank it as if it might disappear. Relief did not arrive as gratitude. It came as weakness. The mother's knees buckled slightly when she sat. Her body, which had held itself rigid for so long, seemed uncertain how to remain upright without the constant instruction to endure. Around her, other women displayed the same trembling hands, the same unfocused stares. Safety felt provisional, like a rumor that might be withdrawn. In one corner of the room, a group of German prisoners of war sat under guard. Their uniforms were dirty, their faces unshaven. They watched the civilians with a mixture of embarrassment and curiosity. One of them, no older than 20, caught the mother's eye. He looked away quickly, as if ashamed to be seen in that state. A British guard stood nearby, rifle slung but not raised. He spoke to the prisoners in a calm tone, pointing toward a stack of blankets. There was no shouting, no striking. The prisoners moved as instructed. The mother had imagined this moment differently. She had prepared herself to witness cruelty, to shield the children from it. Instead, she found herself unsettled by restraint. It left her without a script. Hatred had been easier to brace against. That evening, bread was distributed. Each portion was measured carefully. No one received more than another. The children ate slowly, unused to food that did not require calculation. The mother forced herself to chew despite the tightness in her throat. She realized she had forgotten how to swallow without fear of running out. Across the room, the young British soldier from the cellar stood by a window, smoking. His posture was slouched, his expression distant. He looked less like an occupier and more like a man counting the hours until sleep. When a child began to cry somewhere near the door, he flinched slightly before turning away. The sound was sharp in the otherwise controlled quiet. Trust did not return with a single gesture. The children still startled when boots crossed the floor. They still whispered to one another even when told they could speak normally. The mother caught herself lowering her voice out of habit. The war had trained them thoroughly. Unlearning it felt like another task added to exhaustion. Outside the building, lorries continued to arrive. The conflict had not paused for this room. Smoke lingered over distant rooftops. The future remained undefined. No announcement was made to explain what would happen next, how long they would stay, where they would go. Information, once delivered daily through loudspeakers and papers, had vanished. In its absence, uncertainty filled the space. Late in the night, when the children finally slept, the mother lay awake on the narrow cot. She listened to the breathing around her, the civilians, the prisoners, even the guards who took shifts near the entrance. It was a shared vulnerability she had not anticipated. The men she had been told to fear slept only a few meters away, their weapons resting against the wall. The house had stood empty for weeks before they chose the cellar. Windows were shattered, the upper rooms exposed to wind and soot, but the stone foundation still held. In the narrow space beneath the kitchen, the air was damp and carried the sour trace of old potatoes. That was where Frau Keller gathered her children when the shelling drew closer and the rumors began to harden into fact. The British were moving through villages to the west. Men who had not already been taken for the front were gone. Only women, children, and the elderly remained to wait. They had been told what waiting meant. The children knew the instructions by heart. No sound, no movement. If soldiers came, they would not beg. They would not speak unless spoken to. Their mother had repeated what she herself had heard for years, that enemy troops showed no restraint, that they despised Germans, that mercy was weakness. The youngest, Anna, 6 years old, understood only that boots meant danger. Heavy boots on wooden floors meant doors broken open and shouting. The first time they heard them, the sound traveled through the beams above like a slow hammering. Not hurried, not frantic. Measured steps crossing the kitchen. The cellar door trembled once, then stilled. Frau Keller held both children against her coat. It was early spring, but underground the cold did not lift. Their breath made faint clouds in the dark. The boots moved again. A cupboard opened. Something fell and shattered. Anna buried her face in her mother's sleeve to stop herself from crying out. Above them, a man's voice spoke. It was not loud. The words were unfamiliar, rounded differently, but the tone was steady. Another voice answered, shorter, almost questioning. Then silence. Frau Keller waited for the door to be forced open. For the expected rush of light and hands. For the story she had been prepared to endure. Instead, there was a pause, then the scrape of something being dragged across the floor. The boots receded. A back door creaked. After a few minutes, there was only wind moving through broken glass. They remained in the cellar until the light above shifted toward evening. When she finally opened the door, the kitchen was empty. 2 tins sat on the table. She stared at them for a long time before approaching. One was opened already, the lid folded back. Meat and jelly. The other was sealed. She did not touch them until she had checked every room. The children watched her carry the tins downstairs. She placed them on the dirt floor as if they might explode. They had not eaten properly in 2 days. The last of the bread had gone stale and then moldy. She divided the contents carefully, apologizing with her eyes for the small portions. No one spoke while they ate. The next morning, more boots came. This time they stopped at the cellar door. A knock followed, not violent, but firm. The sound felt worse than shouting. It suggested patience. Frau Keller told the children to stay behind her. She opened the door herself. 2 British soldiers stood there. They looked younger than she had imagined. Their uniforms were muddied, their faces unshaven. One held his rifle low, not raised. The other gestured toward the cellar interior and asked something in broken German. She did not answer at first. Her throat felt tight. She expected them to enter without permission. Instead, they waited. The taller soldier repeated the question more slowly. Water? He pointed to a canteen. She nodded once. He handed it to her without stepping inside. The other soldier glanced at the children and then away quickly, as if uncertain where to rest his eyes. They did not search the cellar. They did not demand names. After a brief exchange she barely understood, they moved on to the neighboring house. The children remained motionless long after the boots faded. In the days that followed, the pattern repeated. Soldiers moved through the village in small groups. Some houses were marked with chalk. Others were left untouched. A few elderly men were questioned in the square. There were no public punishments, no fires set deliberately. The church bell remained intact. Rumors shifted, but fear did not disappear. It changed shape. Anna began to associate the sound of boots with something else. The possibility of water, sometimes a biscuit pressed awkwardly into her hand by a medic who smelled of soap and tobacco. The first time it happened, she did not take it. She looked to her mother, who hesitated before giving a small nod. The medic's expression did not soften. He did not smile. He simply moved on to the next doorway. Frau Keller lay awake at night trying to reconcile what she saw with what she had believed. She had been told that restraint was a trick, that cruelty would follow once defenses lowered. Every quiet day felt temporary, like the air before a storm. She listened for raised voices, for breaking glass, for the moment when discipline would slip. It did not. Instead, there were routines. Trucks arrived at regular intervals. Supplies were unloaded and recorded. A field hospital was established in the schoolhouse. Wounded German soldiers were treated there alongside British ones. She saw it herself when she went to search for news of her husband. Through the open doors she glimpsed rows of cots and white bandages. No one was turned away at the entrance. The sight unsettled her more than violence might have. One afternoon, an elderly neighbor, Herr Braun, collapsed in the street. He had refused to leave his home during the final bombardment and now struggled to breathe. A British patrol stopped when they saw the small crowd forming. One soldier knelt beside him without removing his helmet. Another called for the medic. There was no interrogation first. No demand for documents. They carried him carefully to the schoolhouse. The villagers watched in silence. Gratitude felt dangerous, almost disloyal to the years of instruction that had shaped them. Yet fear, too, began to feel misplaced, as though it belonged to an earlier time that had not fully ended but was losing its grip. At night, in the cellar, the children whispered questions. Why did they help? Were they pretending? Had the warnings been wrong? Frau Keller answered cautiously. She told them that soldiers were soldiers, that discipline mattered, that war had rules. She did not admit her own confusion. The boots no longer sounded like a single threat. They carried different meanings depending on who listened. For some, they still triggered panic. For others, they suggested order returning, however foreign. Weeks later, when the front had moved further east and the village settled into occupation, the cellar was used less often. The family slept upstairs despite the broken windows, preferring cold air to the closeness below ground. Yet the cellar remained in their minds as the place where certainty had cracked. Anna would later remember fragments rather than events. The feel of damp earth against her shoes, her mother's coat collar against her cheek, the steady rhythm of footsteps overhead, and the unfamiliar sound of a knock that did not break the door.